Hey class, I'm Daisy and I'll be sharing more on Cmiique Iitom, which is spoken by the Comcaac, also known as Suri. Cmiique Iitom is less commonly but more accurately identified as such, and its speakers call themselves Comcaac. It is listed as Suri in the World Atlas of Language Structure, which is an exonym established by unknown origin but adopted by the Mexican federal government when in reference to the indigenous language and the indigenous group. A possible translation means people or spry, and these translations are provided by neighboring languages. For the purpose of clarity, I'll be referring to Cmiique Iitom as Suri and the speakers as Comcaac rather than Suri Indians. Suri is spoken in the Sonoran Desert on the California Gulf Coast in the towns of Punta Chueca and de Sombec, and it's also spoken off the mainland coast in the islands Tiburon and San Esteban. It does have a few speakers, only about 750, but considering that the Comcaac have a community between 700 to 900, this suggests that the children are learning their parents' native tongue. Even though they are also receiving instruction in Spanish, the dominant language spoken in Mexico does not supersede their native language. Suri is an indigenous language of North America. Geographical barriers, including the Sea of Cortez, the Sonoran Desert, and mountain ranges, have isolated the language, and archaeological evidence suggests that the Comcaac have been long established, at least 2,000 years ago, so they have a long-lasting legacy there. Due to this isolation, there are very few loanwords, and it's conservatively viewed as an isolate, but linguists have tried to relate it to human languages of Alta California. Because of the declining population and the fact that the Comcaac also have entered intertrade, requiring them to learn lingua francas such as Spanish, the language Suri is considered endangered, yet preservation efforts have successfully introduced a written form. A little more background on who were the Comcaac, or who they are. They were formerly semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers that moved in bands of 50 with no formal leader, with the exception of a significant figure in the shaman. They're now settled in the two towns as commercial fishermen and farmers, and mutual hostility between the Comcaac and neighboring tribes and Spanish speakers have enabled them to preserve their language and culture, but it's also contributed to their declining population given the constant conflict. Some of the Aboriginal social and religious customs include a value in singing because of its utility for medicine, record keeping, storytelling, and expression. And they also have respect and they also respect and revere the environment. And given that the harsh environment encourages gratitude for it and its offerings. I chose to study or to research Suri because it is seldom studied due to negative conceptions of indigenous languages and culture. There's this false idea that indigenous languages have a limited lexicon because they don't seem that advanced. And the simple tools that the Comcaac did use portray them as primitive, and their language is not worth recording. There are a few linguists that have contributed a bulk of the research, and these include Marlette and Moser and Moser. On to the linguistic analysis. I'll be covering the phonology, morphology, and syntax. And as a more illustrative introduction, you can hear a Comcaac man singing in Suri. The phonology includes a moderate sound inventory with few vowels. The 4 vowels include I, E, A, and 17 consonants, which are seen in the table here, which are stops, fricatives, nasals, and non-nasal resonants. There is an additional consonant, r, used in Spanish loanwords, such as meron, which is Suri translated from melon, and roco, which is loco. More complexity is seen in the syllable structure, and this was especially noted by Marlet, who saw pairings or groupings of consonants at the beginning and ends of a word, and groupings of vowels in the center typically. This is more significant, or the syllable structure is more significant when you consider the morphology, which we'll get to next. Moser and Moser were especially helpful in creating an alphabet and introducing a written form to the Comcaac in order to compile a list of vocabulary words. They wished to demonstrate the extensiveness of lexicon, which Suri is definitely rich in. And they also revealed how the vocabulary is still changing, as there are terms for traditional culture as well as newly introduced, which is paradoxical since the language is considered dying, but it's far from stagnant. The alphabet to an English speaker doesn't seem quite phonetic, and I'll kind of give you a sample here. The text, as you can read it, and then a Comcaac man actually saying it. Oops, back. Um, for its morphology, it's more synthetic than isolating. It's like agglutinative, but also sometimes fusional. And this is especially seen in the verbs. Almost all inflectional morphemes are prefixes, and since verbs are one of the two major word classes, they are morphologically more complex, and this can vary based on the tense, the person agreement, negation, unspecified object, and causative. Given the complexity of the verbs, there's a rare use of adjectives, and even most quantifiers, like numbers, appear as intransitive verbs. The other major word class are nouns, and verbs and nouns can sometimes be derived from each other. For example, verbs can be derived from nouns using the prefix I, as in tamt shoe to itamt, half shoe. Such complexity means some verbs may have multiple translations. For example, there's multiple terms to mean to transport, and it has ranging specificity depending on method and position. There's also specificity attached to nominal determiners, and so there's various ways of saying the based on position, location, and whether the subject is singular versus plural. This aids a developing noun class system and allows identical terms, but maintains the distinction nonetheless. Like it's seen in sun and day, which have the same term za, but can be distinguished with the article ki za or the article kap za. The syntax follows an SVO word order for the most part, and it's generally head final, with the main phrase or head preceding other phrases. Its head final is seen less commonly, and it's unlike English. It's like recognizable in Yoda speak. Consequently, in key ways, Sarah uses head marking and others dependent marking to show to better show this head final syntax. The determiner can also be phrase final, which is another interesting linguistic feature, since the noun phrase precedes the article. For example, the horse, translated que cap, is directly translated horse the, in which que is horse and cap means the. Suri is also a pro-drop language, similar to Spanish, in that it omits pronouns because inflections in the verb can reveal the subject. There's also an imperative mood for demands, an interrogative mood for questions, as seen by inflections in the verb. So this means that questions are not, or like demands are not well formed solely on intonation. Questions may also have a ya morpheme, which is added to the predicate. Finally, much of Suri uses passive construction, meaning the subject is the recipient of an action rather than the agent. This happens even in sentences when an agent seems more likely. For example, hizi yopazitum is directly translated as it was tattooed us, or we were tattooed, rather than saying I got a tattoo. I provided more samples of Suri so you can see its linguistics features applied. Descriptions are either nominalized or expressed through intransitive verbs, since adjectives are not considered a major word class. So you see this in the first sample, the vehicle that Maria bought. This is the over here is the is the nominalized determiner, or the nominal determiner, and this is a descriptive phrase, but it's presented as more of a noun. It also demonstrates the head final, as the verb is the head, and it's seen last even in that small phrase, and also the phrase final of determiners, since even Maria, which is like a noun, is followed by that key, the article. Verbs also have complex morphology. This is demonstrated in the second sample with ran, and it kind of shows how it's hard to find like the root of the word. So it's a bit agglutinative and fusional. I think in this case more fusional. Maybe no. No, yeah, I'm not sure. The horse is going to injure you if it swings its head. The final sample shows, what does that show? It shows another way that Suri is very head final, in that the head phrase, it will injure you, is final. And it also shows how the possessor noun precedes the possessed noun. So you see Gai Kap, the horse, and Kap In Kap, the head. So the horse's head, essentially. And then the verb is more important, so it's seen last. And in the second part of the main phrase, it's harder to directly translate, but I'm guessing that since the verb usually goes final, that it's possibly ha-he with sai. Oh no, sai is probably sai, because in another interesting fact is that the auxiliary verbs usually follow after the lexical verb. So like it's the opposite of English, where you'd say I am walking, instead you'd saying I walking am. So it might be that hi he are the auxiliary verbs and sai is the verb. But I'm guessing more so that anso is the verb, and this is maybe the auxiliary sai, and ha-he maybe to indicate you. Ma for sure though is a morpheme that is an example of that dependent marking we were talking about earlier, since it shows that there's a preceding phrase, a preceding dependent phrase. Okay. Because Suri is different from Indo-European languages, word-for-word translations are not expected. Okay. In conclusion, I think Suri, Cmiique Iitom, exhibits the endurance of a language and the associated culture, since it's been around for 2,000 years. It's been allowed that time to develop on its own, and it's has some interesting developments even now. Um, there's this bias supporting lingua francas and often overlooking indigenous languages. Yet I think indigenous languages like Suri do help conceptualize stuff we overlook as well. Like, for instance, the balance between people and nature. Um, Especially when you consider its like it's leaning towards passive construction. Um, Sri kind of mimics that relationship of how we rely on nature, but nature does not rely on us. And when you also consider its focus on verbs, even applying verbs to things we consider nouns, like how the word for offspring in Sri means to have a good view, it reveals an inclination to observe of the Comcaac, and how this ability to notice nature is especially salient now when modernization changes the environmental landscape with overfishing and tourism. The creativity of the language suggests a creative way of looking at the world and possibly a creative way of enduring it. So it should definitely be preserved and recorded. I thank you for your time, and I do encourage you to finish watching the attached video in which Comcaac individuals better illustrate why they wish to preserve their native language. Thank you.